Good evening and welcome to the last Bleacher Forum series of the year. I'm Françoise Meltzer, Interim Director of the Frankie. Next year there will be Richard Neer who will be the director. Richard Neer is in art history. We're really looking forward to that. So welcome, that's my point. We will have another one of these forums, I suppose I should say fora, next November, this coming November. As you know, tonight our speaker is Rosanna Warren, who's going to be introduced by our colleague Rachel Galvin. So let me say a few things about Rachel Galvin. She is an associate professor in the English department, having just received tenure quite recently. Happily for us. She's been a Frankie Fellow this year because she's on leave. And I just want to tell you that her specialty is 20th and 21st century poetry, which she does in English, French, and Spanish. She does Latinx poetry, poetry of the Americas, hemispheric studies. She does poetics, politics, literature. Very multilingual, and I'm happy to say that as of July 1st, she will also be a member of the Department of Comparative Literature, which is my department, so I'm particularly thrilled. She is also a poet in her own right and a translator. So how could it be more appropriate for a poet to introduce a poet? Please join me in welcoming Rachel Galvin.
Hello, good evening. It is my honor to introduce Rosanna Warren to you today, who I am fortunate to count as a dear colleague of mine. Rosanna is the Hanna Holborn Gray Distinguished Service Professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. She's a renowned practitioner of that trifecta of literary vocations, poet, translator, and scholar. Her acclaimed poetry collections include Stained Glass, which was named a Lamont Poetry Selection by the Academy of American Poets, Snow Day, Each Leaf Shines Separate, Departure, and Ghost in a Red Hat. The poet Anthony Hecht has put it aptly, writing that Rosanna Warren, quote, lives in our tarnished, everyday, ramshackle world of loss, anguish, and sacrifice. But she inhabits, almost as vividly, a realm of classic purity, and in some of her best, most moving poems, she dwells in both regions at once, and within, as it seems, the same breath. It is a beautiful miracle of bilocation. I love this quote, and this is a quality that I find throughout Rosanna's poetry and also in a poem she just published this week in The New Yorker, which you may have seen. I see some nodding. The poem is called That the Earth is Suspended, and she writes in a treatment of both the pre-Socratic philosophy of Anaximander and a timely description of how tough it can be for spring to emerge. She writes, May unclenches, but not enough. Buds grip fetal leaves. Each night scatters frost. On sidewalks, we tread on broken sky. And you can find this poem on the newsstands right now. Rosanna has published a highly regarded book of literary criticism titled Fables of the Self, Studies in Lyric Poetry. In her endeavors as translator and editor of translations, she has published a verse rendition of Euripides' The Suppliant Women, which she composed with Stephen Scully. She has edited multiple translations of Eugenio Montale by William Arrowsmith, from his poetic diaries to Cuttlefish Bones. She has edited 3 chapbooks of poetry by prisoners and a collection titled The Art of Translation, Voices from the Field. Her own poems have been translated into French, Italian, Russian, and Polish. In a recent interview, Rosanna described her translation objectives by using an analogy that I find striking. She said, I think of it as shamanistic and theatrical. I tried to create an illusion in English of the feel of the form of the original. To me, it has to be performable. It has to be almost singable. And it has to give the hearer, listener, reader the illusion of being under the spell of something like original music. Translation is a kind of poiesis, an act of making that involves inspiration and surely magic when it is in the hands of Rosanna Warren. She's a recipient of too many awards for me to enumerate, but I will just mention that she has been laureled by the Academy of American Poets, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies, among others. She's an indefatigable writer and is currently working on a biography of Max Jacob, the French writer, whose work as poet, artist, and critic forms a crucial link between symbolism and surrealism, and I understand it is due out next year in 2020. It is with great pleasure that I look forward to hearing Rosanna read her poems today on the topic of women, power, magic, and damage. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Rosanna Warren.
Thank you, Rachel, for that so generous and gracious welcome. And thank you, Françoise, and thank you all for coming. This isn't quite my voice. I've had quite a cough for several weeks. So I'm brandishing a cough drop, which I may need. So I threatened to read some poems about women, power, magic, and damage, and I will try to keep that promise. These are all poems from a new book of poems, which will be out next year. The book is called So Forth, and I hope you'll find in these poems, on the one hand, there are poems which may seem to you sort of personal, and they give a kind of illusion of something possibly autobiographical, and others, frankly, fictive or historical, resurrecting, say, a woman poet from the 16th century. But I would like to say I think of them all as fictions, and fiction in the serious sense of giving us a fable which has some kind of essential truth in it. At least I hope that's what you'll feel. And as for the damages in these poems, there are many damages. I'm as interested in the damages that we inflict on others as I am in the damages we suffer. I think the damages we inflict on others, we may learn more from. So these are a few of the poems from the new book. So I'm looking at my watch so I don't go egregiously over time. Cotillion photo. These young women will last forever, posed like greyhounds, trapped in the silver crust of the frame. You can't tell one from another. The breed is so pure. They will never run. Each one aloft on a frozen wave of white cotillion lace, to resemble marriage, to resemble fate. I remember July sun pouring down in a prickly meadow and a garter snake skin laid out like fairy lingerie on a stone wall. This was Connecticut. There would be a stone wall. Crickets were scraping marrow from the day. I was young. I'd been alone for weeks. I painted the meadow morning and afternoon, trying to capture the crackling sound with my brush. I was reading Oedipus Rex. I understood neither the snakeskin nor the play. Your life is one long night, said Oedipus to the prophet. Oedipus, who saw nothing. Oak trees rustled in drought. In saffron grass, small creatures skittered. There came a day when I said to myself, I should prefer to sleep. Small planets tasted dry and bitter on my tongue. And 2 days later, I woke, alone in the creaking barn at dusk, not knowing what day, what month, what year, but feeling the hall of earth rolling on its way. It is not your fate that I should be your ruin, the prophet said. I moved my arms, my legs. I unclenched my hands and stood up, dizzy from the cot. What was to come would come in its own good time, outside the frame. The moon was rising above the hill. A shy wind gathered force, and trees, in their black silhouettes, linked arms. This next poem looks farther afield. Shelf. A human skull among the bibelot. Dust to dust, it all evens out on the shelf under a veil of gray. There was a think in that cavity once. I have forgotten whole years of my life. In those eye sockets once, surprise and fear. You picked it up in a field in Turkey, a small head, a child, a youth. Who knows how he, she died? Though we can imagine, yes, horribly imagine, and so forget. Better look at the Kenyan statuette of a woman carrying a pot on her head, or the soapstone dove from Japan, or twisted driftwood. Why go looking for sorrow? Yet we look, we hunt. You probe the boiled mackerel head for every mite of sustenance, brain, the tiny white golf balls of eyes, the fatty ribbon along the jaw, an augury in each bite. I don't want to remember how much pain I've caused. Centuries of war we store in our craniums, but in that skull, now crouched on the shelf, no echo. No prayer, only air, a relic of air. And of course, if you think whose skull might be lying in Turkey, you might think about 1913, 1914, 1915. All right, here's some damage of another kind. When I was younger, and I mean a feverish adolescent trying to be a painter and a writer, and then a slightly less feverish young woman trying to mainly write. I had very little sense of myself as feminine. My ideal was androgynous, and I wanted to be Matisse, frankly. It didn't work out. So it was only later, having children, growing into the complexities of life, that gradually it sort of dawned on me more and more that there was a reality to be explored in womanhood, in various versions of it. So some versions of that come into this book, and here's a poem that has touches on it at least. Rats. As if you rose out of your coffin, as if my heart was your coffin, you rose yesterday in the turquoise faceted light of syringes, hospital sheets, and toxic Niagara mist. You painted into a glossy forever. I felt again your weight upon me that Manhattan night in our quasi-childhood. You moved lovelessly upon me, almost angry. Anger I almost allowed myself to know as we lay on a borrowed floor trying to make what might be called love. You broke each spell, the way Proust discovered love, in captured rats squealing as the hat pin probed their vital organs. I was a slow student. I learned dumbly, blindly, and graduated to my own destructions. The white rats scamper through your landscapes of pill bottles and blood, chopped trees and massacred Adirondack deer. And I dream of knocking all the books off my shelf so that in the light breaking from those pages I might behold, not hold, your broken face. I find the longer I write that images of breaking haunt me and recur over and over in different ways. And I'm enough of a believer in some kinds of sacrifice to hope that sometimes light breaks through too. Here's a poem called Tosh, the Jewish ceremony of the second day of Rosh Hashanah, when you go look for running water and cast bread in it. There is an epigraph and there are a few lines in the poem from the Psalms, especially the De Profundis. Tashlich. Thou wilt cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. We needed a running stream, but we had our sins. We carried our sins, but we needed bread. We found bread. We carried bread in small, stale lumps to the river running as it ought, with water slapped in the face again and again by wind. Glister from high rises began to wink like foil in the crinkled waves. The pier carved into the current. What brilliant sins shook in the punished waves. Do high-rise sins shine brighter? What were your sins? You wouldn't tell, nor would I ask. The piles from ruined piers poked at the not-quite indigo dusk while cars thrummed along the elevated west side monotone. And planes whined higher, carrying higher sins. And how was it? How did it come to be that I crushed someone's heart? It wasn't like tossing bread in a stream. Then how could it be absolved by casting bread? That heart wasn't stale. It wasn't a lump. No. More like a wounded pigeon, as if I'd stamped on its chest with my heel as it flailed, and now the chorus of excuses rises in plain song. You toss your bread. The railing is cold at my chest. Your bread shivers and bobs in the waves. I clutch my bread. And what do they mean by sin? I clutch my question. Night is hustling down over New Jersey, over the restless flow, the contradiction between a river's thrust to the sea and the tide's upstream beseeching, roughed by wind. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He lays up the deeps in storehouses, so I raise my hand in the dark. I unclench my fingers. I let one more sorrow, one more question fall into the sodden and anonymous night. One reason I love living in Chicago is that there's so much water. I mean, in this room, it's wonderful. You can see the lake there, you see the river there. I've always tried to live near water. This is another poem, a New York poem, thinking about the Hudson River, among other things, and also some more damage. As if the massive, grimy river shouldered its way toward the harbor, I stood under the ruckus of sky. The wind plucked awnings, plastic bags, newspapers, and sent the news twirling over corduroy waters. I'd meant to see art, but the plan miscarried. A guitarist stationed in a doorway bent his head to rasp his ballad into the wind's sore throat. Rainlight glossed the guitar strings and played its own tune. This city, such a storm of wants. You have a right to your actions, but never to your actions' fruits, said Krishna in a book I read, with all the et cetera about desire and emptiness. What did I want? And why did I want it so hard? Not emptiness, but a self like rain driven aslant the fence, the hacked-at sycamore. That morning, laid out on a marble slab at the store, the exposed red knob of a fish's heart kept its pulse in the butchered half-creature. No gills, no head, no fins, no guts, no tail, just the flat half-body and spine and the heart, blurping and shuddering in its own obstinate rhythm, as if, it seemed to say, as if, you idiot, you ever could be free. Let's see. I'm not very good at chattering between poems, and it sort of irritates me when poets do it, but on the other hand, I realize that you just can't have poems fired at you without any respite, so I try to arrive at some kind of compromise. I grew up partly in France, and I try to spend some time there every year. Last few years, we've been spending some weeks in the summer in the town of Montpellier. The France that I know is not a tourist France. It's, as you, God knows, it's not a secret now. France is not a happy country. And the last few years, there's a whole sort of, to me, it was a new kind of population of homeless people, SDF, sans domicile fixe, without fixed abode, sort of youngish, often dressed in military fatigues, often with really quite fierce-looking dogs. Not the old clochard at all. So this is a poem about, I guess, feeling in some way that we're all homeless on this planet, possibly, in different ways. Sans domicile fixe. Clouds like boulders. Boulders like petrified clouds that rolled down and stalled in the meadow. That was yesterday. Now we're in the centripetal apartment with peonies aging in 2 vases, pink and cream petals frizzling into crepe. Mirrors multiply the years. I see you seeing me in the gilt-framed oval by the desk. I see us both in the window reflected in the closet door glass. My eye corners crease. Flecks of dark chocolate streak the inner spines of all the books. Words are drugs. Love is a drug, while Europe contracts into dark burgundy upholstery and cushions. Deep in the French-English dictionary, 3 asterisks mark extreme vulgarity. How long can we stay here? Outside, the new homeless twist dreadlocks and pace their mastiffs. Tattoos bulge on their forearms, paper wrappers and crushed cans clot the gutter. Sun leaps off the roof tiles. A brisk sea wind. In the mountains, those small purple flowers with pods and curling tendrils, now you tell me, were vetch. And I don't know why it is, but I just adore that word, vetch. I'm sort of waiting for a way to get it into a poem. This next poem is quite a different tone and has nothing to do with women. It's a poem, but I think it has to do with that ugly building a little bit over there, Trump Tower, and what it represents. Though my political poems are usually displaced imaginatively, so Ostensibly, this poem is about Milton and Samson agonistes and what it's like when your vision of the just society and just government have collapsed around your head. Somehow, that seems of concern today, whether the government's collapsing or not, etc. Samson, 1674, for John Milton. Their theaters cackle and bray, their carriages clutter the streets, cockades, torches, liveries clash. Philistine hearts, jocund and sublime, they smear their deals, gold on columns and cornices. Temples fume with burning fat. The choicest girls parade with coal-ringed eyes and spangled thighs. Let the poor creep into shadows. They offend. The prisons teem, and one old man sits in his doorway in a loose gray coat, letting sunlight lay its palms upon his sightless eyes. He's seen too much. Kingdoms askew, skies collapsing, idols crammed back into shrines. Let the mad cavalcade pass by. There's a kind of defeat that resembles victory. There's a temple raised up only in the mind, and another to be pulled down in dream, arms wrapped around massive pillars to tug and shatter the roof on guzzling lords. Not by his arms, not by his gouty hands, but the phoenix spark sleeps in ash. The core of this collection of poems is what gave me my title for today's reading, Women, Power, Magic, and Damage, because I didn't plan it this way. I never really plan my books. They just grow organically. But I found myself obsessed with it grew into a group of poems about remarkable women. And some of them, at least one of them, remarkably awful, as you'll hear, I hope. I call it by the Chaucerian title, Legend of Good Women. I hope you hear ironic resonances there. But they're sort of these powerful women who began to inhabit my imagination. So here are the group of them. It's the whole core of the book. The first one is Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, one of my favorite poets. I think she's a great English poet, 16th century, the sister of Sir Philip Sidney. You would know her work, as so many women writers of the Renaissance, through translation. So she translated many of what the book we know as the Sidney Psalms, because Philip died partway through it, and Mary was a great humanist and a marvelous writer and did many of the poems in the Sidney Psalms. The Sidney Psalms, to me, is one of the most exciting books of poetry in English. It has more variety of verse forms than even Thomas Hardy, who has a huge variety of them. And the first Greek, this is really pedantry, but okay, it's University of Chicago. The first English alcaic, which is a beautiful Greek verse form, that I can find is by Mary Sidney in one of the Psalms. Anyway, she's a marvelous poet. She also translated Petrarch, and she translated Petrarch's Triumph of Death. So that's the title to this poem to her. If you hear some 16th century language in here, you're right, it's me quoting Mary Sidney. The Triumph of Death to Mary Sidney. In your lace ruff, you resemble a giant snowflake or a spider web pearled with dew. What poets you catch in your symmetries at your long table at Wilton. What wits Spenser, Fulke Greville, Drayton pitch into the roasted piglet, stewed apples, carp. If you roused God up, he knocked you back on your heels, lady. O God, why hast thou thus repulsed and scattered us? Through the high windows at Wilton seethe rumors of battle, Philip's pussing thigh, death in the lowlands. Mother wrong, daughter strife stalk the cities. Still, you keep house with grammar, you salt the psalms for long preserving. As smoke in wind, as wax at fire doth waste, the unjust dissolve. Your stanzas stay, still sting the tongue. Dawn finds you kneeling on stone, calling again the bleak God you believe will answer you. You mix medicines, you write in invisible ink, but time trumps fame, which undoes death, which masters chastity and love, which leaves eternity, your master wrote, master of all. And like your lace, your lines shine, not pale, but whitely and more whitely pure than snow on windless hill that flaking falls, as one whom labor did to rest allure. Translate us too, rough line by line, into your crystalline, severe design. One of my other women is the, I think, magnificent painter Gwen John, whose brother Augustus John, these are 20th century painter, English painters, Augustus John, much more famous in their lifetime, but I think Gwen's the stronger painter, and actually Augustus thought so too. And Gwen John lived most of her adult life in France, and she was a model for Rodin and a lover of Rodin for some years. And this poem, Rodin Commands, is from a scene, an actual scene that happened when Rodin commanded Gwen John and his assistant Hilda Floden to make love for his viewing. If you know Rodin's marvelous erotic watercolors and drawings, you have some sense of the activity. Rodin commands. When you will do the unthinkable because the other wills it, as peony petals droop and cringe, and the whole blossom crumples sidewise, open to fingers coaxing it apart, we could call this a loss of form, a velvet shivering. She, upon his instruction, lies down with Hilda, taking leave of her own body, for truly, whose are those limbs entwined, and whose the convulsion trilling down even to stiffening toes? It's his brush that arcs, his aquarelle pleasuring these collapsible blooms. The paper drips and runs, small flames shudder in the coal stove. The bouquet sags. His greatest gift will have been to prove once and for all that the person craving is not. It's always fascinated me why men seem so fascinated by lesbian lovemaking. It's a whole topic of voyeurism there that, anyway, just think Baudelaire, etc. Skipping another Gwen John and moving on to Coco Chanel, who's my moral monster. I think she's a very great artist, a very great clothes designer, and a really appalling person. And it'll come up in the poem, but for those of you who don't know the history of it, she, during the Second World War, she had an affair with a Nazi officer. Chanel. A garment should be logical. Coco Chanel. Yes, I made the perfume. Yes, I am an orphan. Light my cigarette. Just so. The perfect profile intaglioed in air. Now, let the hems down. Now we slash the collar. And when a man enters, always make him pay. Always a stray prince around, before the casino closes. This century tilts. I'm good at sphinxing. Elegance excludes. I exclude milk, waste, tears, uterus. Do I remember the lard-colored orphanage halls? No, I refuse. Place a Coromandel screen in front of the car wreck and your world war, my demi-monde. We live in an age with no interiors, and his blood scrawled the pavement by the crumpled car. Embellishment gives way to line and ease of motion, a Bugatti flair. Wealth assuming the proportion of catastrophe. And if the other was a German officer, I'm on my knees with a corona of pins bristling from my lips. It's not adoration, it's revenge. Charming. Another one of my heroines is the pop singer Marianne Faithfull. For some time, the lover of Mick Jagger. And when she began singing, as some of you who are perhaps my age will remember, and the young probably don't know, she had a really sweet little girl voice. And then she had a period of massive drug abuse and living on the streets. And when she got herself back together again and sang again, her voice was in some sense wrecked. But I think that's when she became a really interesting singer. And there's that album, Broken English. Again, breakage. And those of you who know French poetry will recognize a little Apollinaire in here. A way. The whole trick of this thing is to get out of your own light. Marianne Faithfull. She said she sang very close to the mic to change the space. And I changed the space by striding down the Boulevard Raspail at dusk in tight jeans until an Algerian engineer plucked the pen from my back pocket. As if you're inside my head and you're hearing the song from in there. He came from the desert. I came from green suburbs. We understood nothing of one another over glasses of metallic red wine. I was playing girl. He played man. Several plots were afoot, all misfiring. One had to do with my skimpy black shirt and light hair, his broad shoulders and hunger after months on an oil rig. Another was untranslatable. Apollinaire burned his fingers on June's smoldering lyre, but I had lost my pen. The engineer read only construction manuals. His room was dim and narrow, and no, the story didn't slide that way, though there are many ways to throw oneself away. One singer did it by living by a broken wall until she shredded her voice. But still, she offered each song, she said, like an Appalachian artifact, like trash along the riverbank, chafing at the quay, plastic bottles, a torn shirt, fractured dolls, through which the current chortles an intimate tune. There's another of my heroines. She really is a heroine. Well, I think Marianne Faithfull's a terrific singer too. Is the harpsichordist Sylvia Marlowe, who's been dead for many years, but in her time was considered one of the great harpsichord players. A fugue harpsichord for Sylvia Marlowe. Out of her left hand fled the stream. From her right, the rain puckered the surface. Drop by drop, the current splayed in a downward daze until it hit the waterfall, churned twigs and leaves, smashed foam over stone. From her fingers slid eddies. Bubbles rose. The fugue heaved up against itself, against its own, falling, digressed in curlicues under shadowed banks, around root tangles and beaver-gnawed sticks. She had the face of a pike, the thrusting lower jaw and silvered eye, pure drive. The form fulfilled itself through widowhood, her skin mottled with shingles, hands crooked, a pain. I fled. Now that tempered tumult moves my time into her timing. Far beyond her dying, my tinnitus, I am still, through the thrum of voices, trying to hear. And so I'll just end with a couple more. As Rachel kindly said, I've been quite obsessed with the philosophers we used to call the pre-Socratics. Now Gwen most tells us that they're the early Greek philosophers, but I don't think they're pre-Socratic. Here's Thales. Solstice, and the mountain streams run dry, but leave their script, stained slate, caved ledges, middens of twigs. Driftwood skeletons hem the reservoir. But the one who first measured solstices, predicted a solar eclipse, calculated the height of a pyramid by the ratio of its shadow, and taught us water is the only element, left no writing. Turtles are on the move. Small tanks in regulation military gray with scimitar claws, switchblade tails, broad-plated faces, obsidian eyes and beaks inch across tarmac looking for nesting ground. They will lay ferocious eggs and abandon them. All things are full of gods, Thales is said to have said. You can hear them hissing. You can hear them clack their beaks as they stare at us. You probably don't think this is a political poem, but I wrote it last summer in a political fury and despair and rage. And if you've ever met a snapping turtle face to face, you know what I'm talking about. I think I'll end with this one. This is for my daughter, Chiara, who is a psychiatric social worker who works with severely psychotic people and their families. Are we being invaded? For Chiara. Leaves crackle beneath our feet, tinder kindling, as we walk by the brook, the crabapple tree, a crimson pointy-east nimbus. You want to hold each wounded soul in your hands. Autumn flares, the damaged, the human berserk find their way to you. I don't know how you sleep. In the Gorgon's blood, one drop is poison, the other heals. Fevered autumn, autumn I adore, croons an old song. We stroll the road, scuffing dust, and come upon a garter snake lying motionless, its tail, we guess, nicked by a passing car. When we nudge it, it flips to its back in an agonized S, squirms, but can't advance. Its belly gleams. We edge it into the grass. Do we stop seeing when we walk away? The brook prattles on. Homes far off. Dusk settles slowly among leaves. That's not mercy scattering from its hands. Thank you. And Françoise suggested that if anybody wants to ask a question, or I hope you won't hurl tomatoes, we can do that. If anyone's moved to say something or ask a question. If not, we'll.
It's hard to ask a question after such an incredibly moving and beautiful recital. Don't you think?
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm sort of thrilled and devastated simultaneously, you know?
I hope so. I mean to devastate, but I hope not in a futile way. Yeah, but thank you, Françoise. Yeah. Yes.
So I agree wholeheartedly with what Françoise just said about it's hard to go into questions after that because it was just so marvelous. And I liked your inter-poem talks, even if you don't. But I wondered in the poem about Marianne Faithfull, about the metallic wine.
Yes.
If you could comment on that. And was it an Algerian wine?
I don't remember if it was an Algerian wine. And again, as I said, a lot of the poems that seem autobiographical they have what I think of in a scientific way as data, what Henry James called les données, gathered from life, but they're all sort of transformed. So, but I do know, I think we probably all know what really cheap wine tastes like. And so that cutting to the palate seemed right for an encounter that had no emotional reality except alienation on the side of two people who were strangers and would remain strangers. But I'm glad you picked up on the wine, because I think that's what, for me, that's one of the things poetry does. It's not social science, it's not psychology. If it can make experience real, often in a sensuous way, like the taste of a wine, then it's done a little bit of the work of knowledge, I hope. And I do want to say that for me, poetry should do a work of knowledge. I have very little patience for poems that just seem to show off and dance around and say, look how many words in the dictionary I can use and how brilliant I am. I just have no patience for that. I want poems to go to the heart of something. I want them to matter. Of course, they won't all matter to everybody, and they'll matter in different ways. But the word knowledge matters to me. I want the poems to have a work of knowing.
Rosanna, these were just wonderful, and one of the things that, just to sort of piggyback on what others have already said, it seemed to me that as I was listening to each poem, every word seemed right.
Thank you.
There just wasn't a word that shouldn't be there or seemed an extra. But I do have some questions.
Yes.
One has to do with revision and what's that like for you? And the other has to do with biography. As you were reading the poems about women, they seem to be evocations of the person, but also your own feelings about them. How is that different? How is a poem different from a biography, I guess is the way to put it.
Oh, I love that question.
I mean that as a kind of provocative question because I kind of think the answer is going to be the same. But I'm sure you've worked in both genres. But
what a beautiful searching question. Well, I used the word fiction when I was introducing the reading, and so I give myself latitude in the poems to make things up. And also part of my, if to go back to the idea of the poem as a work of knowing or discovering and then knowing, that one of my instruments for knowing is my feelings and my sense perception. I regard it as an instrument. So the speaker in the women poems, as you notice, gets involved in various ways. Whereas biography, and I've suffered for many, many years with this biography of Max Jacob, I have very strict rules for myself about not making anything up. And I don't even I read lots and lots of biographies and have for years, and I don't like it when biographers said, we may speculate that, and I sort of say, no, you can just stop speculating. I mean, I know biographers have to speculate a little, but I'm very sort of perhaps pedantically tied to evidence. And so I think biography needs imagination, and it needs a moral imagination too, I think, to make it come alive, make the person come alive. But I play by totally different rules in biography. About your feeling of the words being in the right place, I love that. I will say that once Charles Simic reviewed a book of mine in the New York Review of Books and said as an accusation, every word seems to be in the right place. I'm glad somebody thinks it's a good idea.
I agree with that. William James once said of the writing of Henri Bergson, his prose fits his thought like a silk glove. Thank you for the reading. I think we collectively stopped breathing during most of it. My question is about a remark you made en passant, which seemed nonetheless to be a kind of scarlet thread through these poems. What did you mean when you said you wanted to believe in the efficacy of sacrifice?
Another searching question. Oh, yes. Well, that's yes, the deep wound of life. I'm speechless because the question is so deep and significant. I think I grew up in an atheist family, but as a child, I don't know why, but I seem to be always looking for evidence of the sacred. Even as a very small child living in the south of France, I made up a religion and created a temple, made my little brother join, wrote a little Bible all illustrated in colored inks, brought flowers and shells to our carved God, etc. And went through phases of imaginatively, partly growing up in France and Italy, there were always churches around, and often we would live in farmhouses where there were crucifixes all over the walls. So I absorbed all that imagery, but yet belonging to, and I've tried, belonging to actual institutionalized churches has always left me a little alienated, however much imaginatively I wanted to participate. So I sort of always on the threshold. And now my life has been for 10 years or so on the threshold or the edges of Judaism, since my beloved partner is very Jewish, hence the poem Tashlich, and there are other Jewish poems in here. So in different ways, through all these years and through the poems, I think I find myself meditating on the fact of human suffering, like that wounded snake in the poem for Chiara, and the question, do we stop seeing when we walk away? And so instead of having the fact of suffering just paralyze us, I guess I've been seeking for different mythologies, different fictions that make it meaningful and not nihilistic. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
If nobody else has a question, I would like to make a little statement. A former student of mine is sitting over there, Maggie Hivner, and I saw her coming out of Jimmy's one day many years ago, and I suppose she was particularly happy. And I said, how are you? And she said, well, I don't know, I've just learned that poetry can't save the world. And I would like to say, in all seriousness, that I think you have shown us that perhaps it can. Please join me in thanking Rosanna Warren for a wonderful reading.
Thank you. Thank you all. And thank you for asking such beautiful, searching questions, which we're all pondering, or at least I am. Thank you.